Welcome to another episode of Outside Ourselves. I am your host, Kelsey Climbera. Today, my guest is a returning guest. Sarah Hinlicky Wilson is back with us to talk about her newest book on the Ascension. Her book is entitled 40 Facets of the Ascension. You might want to grab a pen and paper as you listen to this conversation with Sarah. She has such a unique ability to speak so clearly and effectively and make connections that I have never thought about before. And really, for the first time, I can say, bring the ascension of Jesus to life for me. That's a scene in the Bible I've spent little time thinking about up until this conversation in this interview. So I know that you're going to enjoy what she has to say. It's going to make you think. And like I said, you might just want to take notes. Make sure to check out her Kickstarter. It's in the show notes below. And look for her new book that will be coming out soon. Sarah, thank you so much for being here tonight, right now. It's morning for you in Japan. But I'm so glad that you are back on Outside Ourselves. It's really good to see you. It's been a while.
It has been a while, and I'm super excited to be on for a second time. I always feel like the first podcast appearance is like, they're giving you a try. But if you're allowed back for a second time, like, okay, you passed the test.
It's good. You're in. Yeah, that is so true. Well, you, like I said, have been on before, but for those who maybe didn't listen to the first podcast with you, can you tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Sure. I'm a Lutheran pastor. I'm wrapping up my ministry at Tokyo Lutheran Church. That's right, the Tokyo in Japan, not any of the other Tokyos you might be thinking of. I've been here about 6.5 years and moving back to the States over the course of the summer. I'm also a theologian. I've written hundreds of articles, a bunch of books. I'm very wide-ranging in my genres. I like to call it trans-genre theology, but people often either mishear it or misread it, so I haven't been using that phrase quite so much lately. But we talked, I think when I was here last time, about my almost 500-page novel about a Lutheran pastor's family, which to me is a work of theology as much as a more kind of straightforward theological book I've written on Pentecostalism and Eastern Orthodoxy, as well as the Transfiguration, and books of short stories. I'm kind of all over the place. And I have a podcast of my own with my dad, Queen of the Sciences. So
it's really... It's really good. I love listening to you guys banter on there. It's fun.
Thanks. I think I find one thing I love about the scripture is that it's in so many different genres. And I kind of think as I trained as a theologian, I got really frustrated that everything is written in the key of Romans. And I'm a Lutheran, okay? I love Romans, but it's not the only way to express theological thoughts. So I guess I just sort of am trying out every genre that's available to expound and proclaim the good news of Jesus Christ.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm curious. I don't think I knew. I'm sure I've heard you say it before, but I don't think I knew you've written a book on Eastern Orthodoxy.
Oh, well, I wrote
specifically
about the question of the ordination of women in the Eastern Orthodox Church. I did my dissertation on a woman named Elizabeth Behr-Sigel. She was a French Orthodox theologian who, at the age of 70, changed her mind in favor of the ordination of women, and then until she was 98. Worked on the topic, and I got to meet her once before she died, and that was kind of how I ended up working in ecumenism between Lutherans and Orthodox.
That's really interesting. I just think their expression of faith is, it is such a different flavor, but there can be crossover with Lutheranism, then there's definitely not. So when you say you like dabbling in the different genres, that just came to mind of a good example of that. So I don't know if that's what you experienced or what you kind of took from that as far as the overall tradition goes.
Oh yeah, there's much that's attractive there. There's much that would not and does not work for me. But yeah, I think also just when you actually meet living people in different traditions of the Christian faith. There are people I deeply respect and admire and have learned from who are formed by Orthodoxy. And I know I have to allow the Spirit to be as generous as the Spirit wants to be in calling people in all different kinds of ways. So I think actually weirdly, as I got more comfortable and confident in Lutheranism, it also gave me a little more grace and generosity towards other expressions of the faith. Like, nobody can do it all, and it would be terrible for us if we did. Like, I can't stand churches that think they got it all. Like, everything, historically as well as theologically. Of course, we have it all theologically, but we definitely don't have it all historically. We have some pretty serious errors in our past. So anyway, So anyway, the Lutheran supremacy needs to be tempered a little bit by some ecumenical generosity. So that's where I'm at right now.
I wish you saying that as you've grown more confidence, you have gained more grace for other traditions. I wish that could be said for everyone. I think that that's a great thing. I think that that's like a great, thing to aim for. But I think that that's so true. And I think we're going to get to heaven and be surprised by some things. We don't have it all figured out.
I hope so.
Yeah, right?
I think there's also something radically purifying about being in a place like Japan, which is less than 1% Christian. And we've met missionaries and pastors from all other different traditions. And like, you just don't have the time to quibble. Like, I still deeply am convicted by things that other people here disagree with, but like, that is not the focus. We're like surrounded by people who are desperate for good news. Like, that's what draws us together and is the focus of attention. And I've heard that about like the Christian community in, like, I don't know, Saudi Arabia. Like, they don't argue. On Christmas, they all get together and do Christmas together. Cause like, seriously, you're not going to divide up in that place according to your denomination or whatever.
Yeah, it's funny. I've literally heard the exact same thing from Magnus Pearson, who's a pastor in Sweden. Because he says, like, if you see another Christian walking down the street, like, you run and you give them a hug. You don't stop to ask them what type of Christian they are. Like you said, there's no time or probably energy for that. So I think that's a good reminder for people in America who have a lot more, ability to kind of quibble over silly things. So anyway, you mentioned that you have, we were last talking about your novel, and since then you're on your second book since then, or third, I guess, if you count the novel. Right?
Yeah.
You've written one on the Transfiguration.
Yes.
And now you're writing one on the Ascension.
That is correct.
And to me right away, I think of, I said this before we started recording, I've thought very, very little about the Ascension in my life. So I'm excited to learn a lot more tonight. But I immediately think of, I feel like there are a lot of similarities between the Transfiguration and the Ascension. Can you talk about that? And did you, are these books kind of, do they go together in a sense? Did you plan to kind of write them together, or did this book on the Ascension come out of the book on the Transfiguration? How did that kind of work for you?
Yeah, you nailed it on the first try. Exactly. So the Transfiguration book started a little over a year ago when I was coming up on my 4th or 5th Transfiguration Sunday. By the way, Lutherans are the reason why we have Transfiguration Sunday. It was always observed on August 6th, still is, by Catholics, Orthodox, and Anglicans. But Lutheran reformers decided it made more sense to observe it during the life cycle part of the church year. So they thought Transfiguration should be the end of the Epiphany season, which makes sense, and the last step before Jesus, because in the gospel, it's when Jesus turns his face toward Jerusalem. So it's a great intro into Lent. So anyway, I had not been in the parish for a long time when I came to Tokyo. So I remember, like, the first time I was preaching on Transfiguration, like, yay, Transfiguration. I know what this is about. It means you can't stay at the top of the mountain forever, right? But there's only so many Sundays, years in a row, you can preach that. And I was like, there's got to be more. This seems like really Christologically significant. This can't just be about us getting over our need for glory, which is how I've almost always heard it interpreted. And so after a few years, I was like, I have no idea what this means. I think I need to do some investigating. So I ended up investigating and finding so much. I wrote a book, 7 Ways of Looking at the Transfiguration. And oh my goodness, there's so much packed into this little story. Definitely hugely Christologically significant for the Gospel of Mark, which is probably the first gospel to be written down. It is the dead center. It is the pivot point of the entire gospel. And Mark, of course, the original ending does not have a resurrection appearance. So often people have taken the Transfiguration to be kind of like a sneak peek of the resurrection. I came to be convinced over time that it's actually more like a sneak peek of the Parousia, of the final Lord of the Harvest. That's what the booths imagery is gesturing toward. But probably by the time I got to the end of that, what really struck me, well, I should say, first of all, I've had so many pastors confess to me that not only is Transfiguration the hardest Sunday of the church year to preach on, they often schedule vacation to get out of it. So yeah. So anyway, pastors, if you need help, my book is available. But what I really noticed is that the way the resurrection is talked about is very different from the way both like Transfiguration and Ascension and ultimately Parousia have more of a through line. There's something very protected about the resurrection. I mean, like in the sense, the way it's talked about has such a distinctive quality. So the Transfiguration is clearly visionary, and even the Ascension with the coming of the cloud, and in Acts, the 2 men who talk about it, and he's taken from their sight, and these kind of indicators of glory. Whereas in the resurrection, it's him, but they don't know it's him right away. He's clearly still a human body, but somehow doesn't quite act like a normal human body does, passing through doors, vanishing, and so forth. So by the time I was done working on the Transfiguration, I thought, well, Transfiguration is actually pointing me to figure out what the Ascension is doing. And somehow sort of my intuition was they are both important, but they're important in how they protect the primary proclamation of the resurrection. So, they're in service of, but not identical to, the good news about the resurrection. And so at that point I was like, well, Ascension is kind of hard to preach on too, but for different reasons. People now are completely, well, we're for one thing, we're totally contemptuous of ancient people. We think they're kind of stupid, and they believe in this 3-story universe and that Jesus went up and kept going. But now we know there's just, outer space and blah, blah, blah. I am not at all convinced that any of them thought that Jesus goes up and just keeps going and then lands in like this other location called heaven. All the biblical language indicates they understood, they could actually distinguish between sky and God's dwelling place. And it makes sense that symbolically you would use up and sky and clouds and light as indicators of the majesty and transcendence of God, but like they knew the difference just like we do. But whenever I've heard people talk about the Ascension or tried to preach on it myself, like it seems like you waste so much time apologizing for the up movement. Like, Jesus is not a rocket ship, we promise. But again, that's sort of like missing the profundity of the Christological testimony by attending to our like anxiety over science questions. So
yeah, you think that people are really held up by locating very physically where Jesus went? Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, because like if he keeps going up, like which is again not what Luke 24 or Acts 1 says. He does go up, doesn't say he keeps on going up, and like
right.
Actually,
he's not ascending to Care Bear heaven, which is what like that's like a big
right.
That's a big fear. Was a big fear of mine as a kid, was that heaven was like where the Care Bears lived. So yeah, he's not like going up into the.
You have a dark little soul. If you were scared of being stuck with Care Bears, I'm impressed. No wonder you ended up Lutheran.
Yeah, I know. How could you be scared of that? I was.
No,
it's
very horrifying. I agree. Or people who are like, oh, we're stuck with harps and wings. It sounds so boring in heaven. Like I'm pretty sure we won't be bored. Yeah.
Okay, that's interesting. So I've heard you talk about, and I know because I've read the Bible, that the Ascension is described in 2 places, right? Luke and the end of Luke and the beginning of Acts. But these accounts they have different details. They are a little bit different. Can you kind of walk us through just the accounts of the Ascension? What is happening? Who's around? All of that sort of
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah, it's amazing what happens when you read the Bible carefully. You notice things you didn't
Yeah.
necessarily notice before. So, indeed, the Ascension is talked about all over the place in the New Testament or alluded to, but Luke is the only one who shows it to us. And he thinks it's so important that he tells us twice. And it's, again, if you think of Luke Acts as one big book in two parts,
Right.
then it's the pivot in the middle, which is another interesting Transfiguration Ascension connection, because for Mark, the Transfiguration is the pivot. For Luke Acts, Ascension is the pivot. So both
Yeah.
are
Okay.
indicating this is Christologically super duper important. And so it's not the resurrection, it is the ascension that's the pivot for Luke Acts. So that's interesting. So at the end of Luke, of course, we have the beloved resurrection appearances of, the two men at the empty tomb, and then the women and the disciples on the road to Emmaus. The first time we actually see Jesus is when he pulls up alongside the pair on their way to Emmaus. He, goes to supper with them, explains about the Christ and the breaking of the bread. He reveals himself and then vanishes. We'll come back to the vanishing, because I think I finally understand what that is all about.
I was going to ask you about that. I'm very curious about that.
Yes. Well, it'll make more sense if I tell you after I tell you more about the Ascension. So anyway, then the Emmaus pair rush back to Jerusalem, and they find out that the Lord is risen and has appeared to Peter. And then they all, when they're all gathered together, so must be more than the 12, because the Emmaus pair are evidently not part of the 12. Jesus comes to them, he shows them his hands and feet, and says, a spirit does not have flesh and blood like I do. Look at my hands and my feet. And he eats a piece of fish. It's very heavily emphasizing his bodiliness. But then here's the thing, all through Luke 24, the time is very carefully indicated, again, like more than almost anywhere else. And then, and next, later, after, etc. It seems that if you just follow straight through Luke 24, it seems to be saying that from that meeting with the whole group that Jesus appears to, he takes them from there out to the Mount of Olives / Bethany. I think it says Bethany in Luke 24. And that is where he parts from them. And it says, while he blessed them, and as he was blessing them, they're both active and passive verbs. He departs and is taken into heaven. And then they go back to Jerusalem, worshiping the whole way. Interestingly, this is the first time Jesus is said to be worshipped in the Gospel of Luke. And the only time that verb is used before is in the argument with the devil in the wilderness, when the devil says, I will give you all this if you worship me. And Jesus says, you shall worship the Lord your God and no one else. So if the disciples are worshiping Jesus at the end of Luke 24, that's Luke's way of merging the identities of the Lord God of Israel with Jesus, and saying it is legit to worship Jesus because what God is what Jesus is as well.
Very cool.
Yeah. So what you don't have there, though, is what we do have in Acts 1. So when we flip over to Acts 1, that's where, of course, we get the 40 days. Luke does not say anything about the 40 days. I have to say, of all the things that surprised me in my study, this is the only one that kind of gave me like a full body shock. Like, what? It's the same night in Luke 24 and it's 40. And, it's because I'm so liturgically formed by the 40 days from Easter to Ascension, and then 10 more days on to Pentecost. Anyway, we can talk about how to cope with that afterwards. Anyway, so 40 days pass. He instructs them, helps them to understand more fully everything about the Christ from the law, the prophets, the Psalms, and so forth. And then finally, on the 40th day, evidently he gathers them again on the Mount of Olives. He says, it is not for you to know the times or the seasons. I think, dear Christians everywhere and at all times, please take this to heart. Nobody knows. Nobody will ever know. Anyway, it is for the Father to know the times and the seasons, and he's not going to say anything about restoring the kingdom to Israel, but your job is to go out there and be his witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and to the end of the earth. And then once again, he is taken from him. But this time, interestingly, a cloud comes. And again, there's active and passive verbs, but the cloud sort of like the word suggests kind of scoops him up from below, like grabs him and takes him and removes him from their sight. So again, he is lifted up, but he does not just keep going up. He is taken from sight. Interestingly, Luke, in both Luke 24 and Acts 1, avoids the very obvious word for ascend. So it's kind of comical. We call it the Ascension, but the one thing Luke never says is that Jesus ascends. Other writers do, John, the Gospel of John especially, but not Luke. He uses lots of verbs, but not that verb. I think he's doing that because he doesn't want people to confuse what happens to Jesus to what happens to Elijah. He wants us to be, no, this is not the same.
Oh, that's interesting.
Ascension. Yeah. No chariots of fire.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And then the other thing is that two men appear in dazzling white. So again, very reminiscent of previous episodes. Sometimes, angels at the tomb or at the Transfiguration, Moses and Elijah. And they say, dear men of Galilee, why are you gawking up at the sky? He will come in the same way that you saw him go. And then they once again leave for Jerusalem and they hang out and wait. They replace the missing 12th with Matthias, and then the Pentecost happens. Interestingly, Luke says it's two men, not two angels who are there. He does not tell us who they are. I know that this is probably in part because I have Transfiguration on the brain, but my guess is we're supposed to infer that it's Moses and Elijah. But if he said again it was Moses and Elijah, we'd probably get super fixated on that, woo, they came back.
That's so interesting. Huh. I've only ever thought of them as angels.
Yeah, no, Luke is not afraid to name angels, at the beginning, at the beginning of his gospel, right? No problem. So I was but it says very plainly two men. What two men would it be? And the only two men I can think of that would have that kind of role and ability to announce when Jesus is coming back seem to be Moses and Elijah. But again, I think if you were to say, hey, Moses and Elijah came back, they'd be like, hey guys, can we hang out? Can we build you 2 booths instead of 3 this time? So I think, but if Luke doesn't tell us, there's a reason he doesn't want us to know. So this is pure speculation on my part. But anyway, what's interesting about specifically the Acts 1 thing is that it's talking about the ascension is for a time. It is not permanent. So we're not going to find out how long the time is, but this is how Luke says there is a coming again. So he's gone up now, but he will come back in the same way. And that's quite consistent with the whole New Testament witness, both to Jesus' bodily removal after the resurrection, but the promise of his eventual return.
Very cool. Okay, so I want to go back before we go much further to Luke 24, because you mentioned Jesus disappears when he's with the 2 men on the road to Emmaus. And then the way I've always read his appearance to the 11 is that he kind of just appears again. It's almost, I don't know which gospel it talks about, them being in a locked room, and then he's just there. So that there seems to be some interesting stuff going on. What is the connection, if any, to the ascension? And I did think when, just in rereading it for this interview, it is interesting that it is all laid out in this one chapter, kind of in this one account for us, where you do have this Jesus in his resurrected body doing all of these things, and then the ascension is kind of the end of that. Right.
So I have learned when trying to understand the New Testament, you absolutely have to go to the Old Testament. And that is, I realized consciously how misleading it is for us now when we see something explicitly quoted, like the prophet Isaiah says, or, Malachi or Zechariah or the Psalm. I think we tend to think those are the only places the Old Testament is being invoked, and they often seem quite random and unconvincing to us. But the more I have come to be immersed in scripture and spend enough time with it to start to see the connections, everything, the entire New Testament is woven out of the tissue of the Old Testament. But I'm bringing this up to make the one exception, which is that Luke, whoever he is clearly, first of all, he is a brilliant writer in Greek. He is eloquent and skilled. There is a kind of poetic, lyric, and all, but at the same time, very historically responsible quality to Luke's writing. Like if you, I'm no super duper Greek expert, but Mark is much rougher, and
Yeah.
John is
I've
poetic,
heard
but
that.
has a much smaller range of vocabulary. He's much more uses like the effective repetition. Luke
Okay.
and Acts vocabulary is enormous, and he clearly knows a broader range of Hellenistic sources than probably like Mark or Matthew do, for instance. And so this is the first time I've really kind of tried to push hard and figure out like I basically started to suspect from some of the reading I did, and the more time I spent with it, is Luke's not just telling us about Jesus' ascension, he's also arguing all of the things that it's not. And I think that has
Mm.
become a really important principle for me to bring to scripture. It's not just telling us stuff, it's also not telling us stuff, if you see what I mean.
Right.
Trying to say,
Yeah.
don't make the mistake of thinking this is that. So, for instance, I mentioned,
Hmm.
I think Luke wants us to be sure that Jesus going to heaven is not like Elijah's going to heaven. I don't think they're meant to be similar. I think they're meant to be quite different. So, in the same way, what I discovered is how many ascension stories there are in Greco Roman mythology and also, especially, in
Mm.
imperial ideology. So I think the most relevant one for us is that Romulus, as in Romulus and Remus, the twins who are the founders of Rome, and Romulus, of course, gives his name Rome to it. All kinds of both Greek and Latin writers who are talking about the founding of Rome talk about the end of Romulus, which is that he vanished. And some
Mm.
people say he was taken to, their equivalent of heaven, Olympus or among the gods. Others, most of them seem to be very skeptical and say probably he was just murdered by his own men, and then they told people that he'd been raptured up to heaven. But the word that is used again and again for Romulus disappearing is exactly the same word that Luke uses for when Jesus disappears. Which at first would be like, wait a minute, is he trying to say that Jesus disappears like Romulus? No, because when Romulus disappears, he is never seen again. There is no sign of his body. He's just gone. But when I think what Luke is doing is suggesting Jesus disappears by his own power, but then he reappears.
Yeah.
So he is not disembodied, and he is not just vanished or taken either by murder or by God or the gods. He is actually is in himself, in his risen body, is powerful and capable to do this thing. So again, if we think of it
Mm.
in terms of making a contrast to what would have been the sort of religious talk everywhere, and again, this time, during Jesus' lifetime, we have seen the supposed apotheosis of Julius Caesar. I mean, that's earlier, but like Julius Caesar was supposed to be rapture, taken directly and divinized. Augustus Caesar divinized. Tiberius is going to end up there as well. Claudius, maybe Tiberius wasn't anyway, but like, so there's definitely this strong Roman imperial ideology of becoming a god upon death and going directly to heaven. But what
Mm.
happens again and again, and you see this clearest in Luke, but I think this is part of the whole New Testament witness to the resurrection, is it is a sustained polemic against the Greco-Roman disembodiment ideology. When
Yeah.
Socrates is dying, he happily says, I'm going to be shed of this body forever. My immortal soul is going to go free. If he knew the word hallelujah, he'd be saying it, because thank God he's not a body anymore. And what the New
Mm.
Testament is saying again and again is, no, the body of Jesus. Like, I think the ascension has forced me to see even beyond what the crucifixion and the resurrection taught me, is that the body of Jesus is the whole thing at stake in the New Testament. All the other
Mm.
claims about him, unless he is conceived and born a body, lives a body, dies a body, rises a body, and ascends into heaven and becomes Lord of all as a body, then the jig is up. There is just no value or truth in the Jesus story unless the body part is true. And oddly
Yeah.
enough, you think that incarnation or crucifixion would have given that to me, but somehow zeroing in on this ascension topic, because that's the far end. That's the point at which you could ditch it if it was just like a
Right.
temporary measure, like, okay, you could do a version of atonement where Jesus becomes a body long enough to do for us what we couldn't do for ourselves, makes the ultimate sacrifice, whatever, but then he gets to also fly free. And what Luke's ascension and all the other ways of talking about ascension or exaltation to the right hand, etc., or even the promise of the Parousia, he will come again in the same way you saw him go. That is insisting
Mm.
he's still going to be a body when he comes back. And it's when he
Yeah.
manifests himself again bodily, that will be the time when there will no longer be any more dispute about his lordship, because he will show himself and we will see him as he is.
I want to push on that a little bit. And this, I feel like this is kind of even silly to ask, but I just kind of want to hear you like talk it out all the way. Like, why is it so essential that Jesus not only had a body, and why is it essential that he reigns and that he is ascended as a body? Like, what does that actually give the individual Christian?
Yeah, well, I think I've learned to be surprised that we can even ask that question, because, and this is like the universal question of the human race. It's not just you asking the question, whether you are in Western civilization or Eastern, there is, I think, being a conscious body is deeply weird. I think actually we are more representative of all of creation than we realize. There's something I would say more recently about the way a kind of actually an earlier science that no longer is really held to by current science, that of a dead mechanistic universe of materiality. We are not like materiality is not dead and mechanistic like people think it is. Like if you go into like cosmological physics or subatomic particles, there's so much weirdness going on, and like subatomic particles are altered by being observed. What on earth does that mean? That's so weird. But for ourselves, our own experience of, if you just think about your experience of being yourself, you have a mind that can range everywhere. You can imagine yourself in other times and places as different things. I think the internet has enabled this to a degree that has deeply confused people about what is possible. We don't need to go into that whole diatribe, though I'm certainly capable of it. But at the same time, you're a body, you're you. Like, I am always right here. Like, no matter where my mind goes, I am always inside of this body. And this body has changed over time from very small to not super tall, but bigger, and bodies go up this way too. And you have to go through puberty and come into sexual maturity. That is a deeply weird experience for everybody. And you age. I'm beginning just like at the very cusp of feeling those effects. And that's deeply weird. And, but you're always here. And I think there's something about the way our minds work that continue, and the way our bodies suffer, even though there's no mind without the brain and there's no brain without the body. Like, we are really, truly one. But I think we have always been so baffled by ourselves, and that our mentation comes out of our embodiment. The weird hope of the singularity or transhumanists to upload their consciousness. Any evolutionary biologist will tell you that is a fool's errand. There is no mind without the body it inhabits. So this whole like kind of weird roundabout way of getting to it is that we still somehow think our true selves are not our embodied selves. But the whole story of the scripture, starting with creation, is making stuff. And stuff, especially living stuff, is always imbued with the life-giving presence of God. I mean, the spirit, before anything else, is the spirit of life itself. But clearly, even light and terra firma are upheld and created by God's word. So in a sense, the whole Jesus story is always throwing us back to Genesis 1 and saying what is redeemed is what God has created, and whatever will be sanctified and newly created. If you go to the other end of the Bible, look at the New Jerusalem, like it's not a spirit realm. It's like the city coming down from heaven. And, there's talks about rivers and trees and our own risen selves. So again, the even to be able to, I don't think I even realized how there's always part of us that's holding out to think that we can do this without embodiment or without matter. And clearly something more has to happen. Paul talks so beautifully in 1 Corinthians 15 and Romans 8 about the the incompleteness or the non-fruition of bodily life. As matter exists now, as physics works now, we cannot live forever. We should not live forever. Cancer is trying to live forever in the way matter works right now. The promise is there will be some kind of further transformation, but whatever it is, it will be embodied, bodily, material. And weirdly enough, the ascended, I think it's because the body of the Lord isn't just risen and still like on this earth, but the risen body is what ascends into heaven and is exalted at the right hand of the Father. That means you can't break the chain at any point along the way, either of the whole testimony to Jesus, but also the testimony from creation in Genesis 1 to new creation in Revelation 22.
Yeah. What's interesting is I just going back really quickly again to the Luke 24 account, because I think it is pretty incredible. And, I don't know Greek, but just to hear all of these things that Christ's resurrected body are doing, and then all of a sudden he just wants fish, and it's so plain and simple. And you're right, there is something about the ascension where you hear he's lifted up on a cloud, and then he goes from sight wherever that might be. But that's to think of like the fact that he is still physical. There is a part of me that's like, oh really? Like it's a little bit like, oh, like there's such a stark contrast there. And so I think that's interesting to think about. And then just a funny story, my second oldest, he's 3, and he's lately been saying if he wants something but he knows he shouldn't have it, or he probably won't get it, or he did something wrong, he'll blame it on his body. So he'll say, my body told me to say that. Or my body did that. And so I've been trying to tell him that he is his body, and his body is him, but it's not quite clicking. So I think that starts probably pretty young. It's interesting that
is actually profound. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. There is something deeply weird and unsettling about being embodied matter. I mean, like, I am matter the way, like, these electronics around me are, and the books behind me, and the glass of the window, and the food I'm like, I am living, I am conscious, but I'm made of the same stuff as this stuff that appears to be inert. And it's a strange thing. And so we are crying out for more. That's not wrong to desire the transformation of the body, but I think because whatever it is will be, like, we can't go there from here. God is the one who bridges the gap. And I think in some ways, some of the deepest horrors human beings have perpetrated is in trying to force matter to become what only God can make it become. And I think there is something in faith, and this is maybe the right way to talk about accepting suffering. There can be a lot of like really awful religious ways of telling people to accept their suffering, but I think this is maybe this is like the avenue to the wise one, is that what you suffer in the body now is truly not forever. And the attempt to make your materiality, either to get rid of it or to force it to become something that it will never be, those are both truly unfaithful in the sense of trying to be God in place of God. And to accept suffering is to say, okay, I am bodily, and pain hurts. Nobody likes pain, mental or physical. But the faith is believing and waiting in the promise that this really is not the end of the story about either my mind or my body. And by the way, does anyone really want to live only in their mind forever? I mean, like, my mind is not always the happiest place to be.
Well, yeah. And all of these, even shows like, I don't know if you've seen the Apple TV show Severance, but this is a whole diatribe, but basically it's a exercise in seeing what happens if your conscience or your psyche is separated from each other, and people are basically mentally stuck in their mind, like they're trapped in their mind. So it's interesting that people push for that, but then every kind of exercise that you see played out, even if it's just, culturally, tends to be very dark and not not a good thing. So we should just learn from Apple TV is what I'm saying. Yeah. That is all really, really interesting. It does lead me to ask, I told you I was going to ask some dumb questions, but if the physical is so important and Jesus' physicality is so important, why did he have to leave? Why did he have to float away on the cloud?
Yeah,
What's going
that is
on
the right
there?
next
And
question to ask.
maybe that gets us kind of to what it means to be at the right hand of God, because I think that's all.
Right.
I'd love to hear you kind of unpack all of that as well.
So, well, what we're told repeatedly about Jesus' exaltation to the right hand of the Father is that he goes there to do two things primarily. One, to send his Holy Spirit upon us, and two, to continue to battle all of God's enemies until the very end, including death.
Mm.
So, Jesus in heaven is not like relaxing at the right hand of the Father, but like, good, I've done it, send the Spirit. He can do the hard stuff
Eating
now,
some grapes. Yeah.
like there is definitely an active sense of Jesus' ongoing battling on our behalf. And then that's kind of I would say the most consistent witness, that and then the sending of the Spirit. The other thing, and this is not exclusive to, but very distinctive to the epistle to Hebrews, which again, I did not understand for all my efforts at it over many years. I finally got it this time, and I had some very wonderful scholarship to help me through it. But Hebrews' real focus is, of course, Jesus makes the final sacrifice, but the whole point of his ascension is in order to bring his blood into the heavenly temple and offer it before the Father. And then that is finished and done with. But now that he has done that, his job is to make continual intercession for us. So this has actually become very, very meaningful and hopeful to me, is to think that,
Okay.
again,
I'm
Jesus
sorry.
in heaven.
I'm going to stop you, Sarah, because you just said something. Can you back up and talk about, you just said that I'm sorry, my mind was just blown a little bit. The whole point of his ascension is to offer his blood as a sacrifice. Where is that found? Is that in early on in Hebrews that's talked about?
The whole argument of Hebrews. Yeah, I know this is mind blowing. I went over it too fast. Okay, so here's the crucial thing.
Your train of thought.
Yeah, no. So in Old Testament sacrificial the whole business of a sacrifice is not just bloodshed. So like the slaughter of the animal happens outside, but then the priest is the one who takes the blood of the animal and brings it into the presence of the temple, to the presence of the Lord, and, splashes it in the place on the altar it's supposed to go. And of course, the once a year on the Day of Atonement goes into the Holy of Holies, to the mercy seat, and puts the blood there. So what Hebrews is doing, which is almost certainly written after the destruction of the temple, when forcibly all sacrifice has stopped, not because Christians or Jews chose to stop doing it, but because there was nowhere to do it anymore. My intuition is that Hebrews is offering comfort to people, both Jesus believers, obviously non-Jesus believers aren't going to be reading this, but they're still probably asking the question like, but these sacrifices have been going on forever. Now what? What he's saying is that Jesus, okay, his blood was shed on the cross, but as with the slaughter of an animal outside the temple or tabernacle, bloodshed in itself does nothing. The blood has to be brought in a priestly way into the presence of God and offered. And, for us, we think blood is death, but for the Old Testament, blood is life. So basically, Hebrews' whole image of Christ is someone who is slaughtered, but then who, through his resurrection, takes his blood into the presence of God. He ascends into God. Hebrews actually says ascends through the heavens of heavens, all the way up, comes into the true temple and offers his blood before the Father and the eternal mercy seat. The Father receives it and accepts it. And now Jesus, who is deathless because he has died, will never die again. He has risen and ascended his blood. Now sacrifice is over. Jesus' sacrifice is over. It never needs to be repeated because he lives forever. Hebrews logic is, Levitical priests die. That's why they have sons, and that's why they keep going. and the blood of the animals is not eternal blood, but Jesus' blood is eternally offered, eternally valid. But now that Jesus has done that, now he takes on another aspect of priestly ministry, which is the ministry of intercession or prayer. So the Jesus who has completed his sacrifice sat down at the right hand of the Father, indicating the completion of the sacrifice. now he is praying for us at all times. And, I never thought about that. I've often like in Romans 8, talking about the Spirit prays within us with sighs too deep for words. But I never really thought very actively about Jesus praying right now for me, for us, for the world, before his Father. And, in a way, it's almost kind of funny to think about God praying to God. But that's probably because we're inadequately Trinitarian, and we think, to be God is only to receive prayer. But of course, Jesus prays in his earthly life, and he's as every bit as much God in his earthly life as he is when he ascends into heaven. So, Augustine always would emphasize the all in allness of God. God is both the giving and the receiving. That's why we as Lutherans say, God gives faith. Like we don't like give God our faith. God gives us our faith. Even faith, even believing in him is God's work. And so in the same way, prayer, God the Father receives the prayer, but also God the Son prays to the Father even now. And the Spirit is gathering us up into this dialogue of prayer between Father and Son. So it's such an incredibly like moving and exciting and comforting sense of like the active ministry of Father, Son, and Spirit now. They're not just like hanging out in heaven waiting for some arbitrary date for this all to end, but they're involved in, again, pouring out the Spirit, praying for us, and battling the ultimate enemies against God and his good creation.
Yeah, that's great. Can you talk a little bit about Christ's role and his where he is found here and now on earth, even though we also confess that he is at the right hand of the Father. And then maybe that will lead to a little bit of the distinction. You've kind of mentioned it already, the distinction between Jesus's role, Christ's role, and the Holy Spirit's role. Because I think that those often get confused. I confuse them all the time. So I'd love to have you kind of clear that up for me.
Yes, no, that is such a good question. Again, one thing that this project made me realize is how easy it is to think that the Son goes up the elevator and the Spirit comes down the elevator, right? So Jesus is gone, but we got the Spirit. And almost like they're mutually exclusive alternatives. So again, I was thinking in terms of Jesus has to leave in order to send the Spirit in his place. But now as I read the New Testament, I think what it's saying instead is Jesus ascends because he is the one with the authority to send the Spirit of God. It actually is part of his investiture with lordship that he sends the Spirit. And the Spirit has very distinctive roles to play. I will eventually be doing a Pentecost book, so I've been trying not to do too much Spirit stuff now, so I have something to say and think about there. But it does seem there is a certain overlap of Spirit and Son, or talking about the Spirit as the Spirit of Jesus in the New Testament. That certainly happens. I think that's because we need to not think that the Spirit has a different witness from the Son, or it's very easy, like even for Christians, to like let the Spirit kind of drift off. If I could just say here, I do not think Western Christians should drop the filioque. The last thing we need is yet another reason to detach the Holy Spirit from the Son. Okay, that's just my little Western Christian polemic here. We needed it. Please let us keep it. Okay, moving on. But the Son continues to be present in distinctively, crucified, risen, ascended Lord kind of ways. And again, thinking about the reality of Jesus' body really forced me to say, what is still bodily? What is still cruciform? What is still present but veiled about Jesus on earth now? Because there has to be a correspondence between his earthly ministry and his presence now. And so just run the thought experiment. Jesus in his earthly life does miracles, but people still don't know who he is. He declares about himself and people don't receive him or understand him. So if it's still the same Lord, it's still the same Jesus, but this is still a time of disputed lordship. Until the Parousia, it's a disputed lordship. Then Jesus' presence on the earth now is also going to somehow be bodily, somehow be cruciform, and somehow be veiled or susceptible to misinterpretation, which I think is why the Spirit's ministry is different. The Spirit is the one who brings you to see behind the veil to understand who Jesus really is. So a couple ways to
Okay.
talk about Jesus' presence now. I think one of the most important ones is in like a Matthew's parables in chapter 26, 25 or 26, where he talks about the sheep and the goats. This is a very famous, Lord, when did we
Mm-hmm.
ever feed you or clothe you or visit you in prison? People often read that to think it's like a charge to the church. And certainly the church should do those things. But the judgment is of the nations, the Gentiles is what, the ethne is what it says in the Greek. And they are the ones who have been attending to these my brothers, which is Jesus' way of saying his flock, his church. So
Hmm.
actually, the way the nations encounter Jesus embodied now is in Christians. And so it's not the same way that believers encounter Christ or come to know him, but it seems to be saying that the nations who are not, professed Christians, in encountering Christians and caring for them, are genuinely encountering Christ. As you did it to the least
Hmm.
of these, you did it also to me. So that's saying that somehow Jesus is truly present in his believers, uh,
Yeah.
in our baptism, in our faith. He's actually, and this is Paul's favorite language. Christ is in us. We are in Christ. Christ
Hmm.
is in us. And I no longer think that's metaphorical. I think that's like actually
Yeah.
saying one of the ways Jesus is bodily present now is in his believers. And of course, that is so important for the early martyrological tradition where people are literally losing their
Right.
lives in a very profound sense when the executioners throw Christians to the lions or put them on the cross or whatever the ways are. They are attempting and to some degree succeeding in killing Christ again, because that's what they want to do. They are
Hmm.
trying to kill Jesus. And what gives the martyrs the power to face death is that Christ is in them. Even as they are suffering in the
Hmm.
body, it's also his body suffering in and with them. That you, of course, we need to doctrinally distinguish this from his own complete and perfect sacrifice from the cross to the ascension. But it's a
Sure.
real bodily presence. And then, of course,
Yeah.
for us Lutherans, one of the most important ways we encounter Christ bodily is in the Lord's Supper, because the bread and the wine actually become the specific local spatial location that we encounter Christ's own body and blood. He is, and yeah, I reread Luther's writings on this, and I just think he's right. I think the way he talks about what it means to be present, including bodily present. I mean, that's why one of the ways Christ is present is in something as just ordinary and concrete as bread and wine, and you eat him. I mean, that's, and John 6, Luther didn't want John 6 to be about the Lord's Supper because of his argument with Zwingli. I think it probably is anyway, but Luther's still right. And we do actually like chomp on his flesh and drink his blood, which means he is assimilated to us bodily. Again, if we can get over our need to make everything a metaphor, what he's actually saying is like,
Mm.
when you eat stuff, it gets assimilated to your body. If Christ is present,
Yeah.
Christ is being assimilated into your body. Why not? Like,
Mm-hmm.
who says that can't happen
Right.
or can't be right?
Yeah.
If we're real and bodily and we need to eat and we need Christ to be in us, why not consume him?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's so interesting. And interesting, the connection. I don't know. I've never thought about it in the way of, I mean, obviously you hear Lutherans all the time say, and it's good to say, Christ is present in something super simple like bread and wine. And that makes sense because our God is a physical God. But then to even carry that out to Christ is present in something super simple and super tarnished, like a Christian, like that's a thing, because I think you typically hear that language of Christ in me as kind of an exaltation of self almost,
Mm-hmm.
when in actuality, to me, it's much more comforting to be like, yeah, he's here.
Right.
He's here and he's veiled in a way. I like that word that you used. And yet also like what a comfort to know that he will make himself known to the non-believer. And maybe I'll know that, but maybe I won't. And that's pretty incredible too.
Yeah. And again, if we're really committed to there being a consistency between the historical earthly sojourn of Christ and his presence now, then what is one of the most distinctive things about his earthly ministry? He eats and drinks with sinners. He hangs out with
Right.
people he should not hang out with. His reputation is tarnished. I mean,
Mm.
seriously, how can the church ever be so obnoxious to think as it's any different now? Like
Yeah.
Christ has been forced to have his reputation damaged again and again by the church. And yet he comes to the church again and again and makes himself present and vulnerable to us. And again, if
Mm.
there's a continuity between Jesus and the people of Israel, what is the whole Old Testament dilemma? But God has chosen these people. They have failed to be what he wants them to be. So either he can abandon them and then all the nations will laugh and say, see, your God is no God at all. Or God can stay faithful to this nation that has betrayed him again and again and suffer the reputational damage that goes with it. I mean, the story,
Mm.
it's one continuous story. And, we so
Yeah.
conveniently cut off, like Jesus from Israel, like, oh, we're not like those bad Israelites. Or, church is something separate from what Jesus is doing. And, or like, we're the right church, we've gotten it all right, and everybody else is wrong. All God
Mm-hmm.
has ever done since Genesis 3 onward is say, wow, these people are estranged from me and alienated from me and rejecting me and pushing me away and pretending I didn't create them. And you know what? I'm not going to give up on them anyway. I'm going to keep forcing myself into their lives. And sooner or later, I'm going to win them over, even if it takes death
Yeah.
on a cross to get their attention.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Well, I'm curious how researching and writing this book, which is it done? Because I know, you're you have a Kickstarter starting probably around the time that this episode drops. So I'm curious like where you are in the process. But all that to say, what this process and what this book has left you as a missionary in Japan? Like, has it changed or brought anything to light that you hadn't thought of before?
Yeah, well, I had my first Ascension Day service last year. We were so tiny that I didn't try to do weeknights things. I did Good Friday, in case anybody's worried, of course. But even Maundy Thursday
Good to
took a
know. I'm glad.
couple years to come along. But yeah, well, it's again, I think being in a place that's so little Christian and still very struggling. I mean, all of Japan is struggling in a way. Every population is declining, not just the Christian population, but the sense of Christ hidden but present is so powerful here. You may probably know of the
Mm,
novel and movie Silence by Shusako Endo about the martyrs of Japan about 500
yes.
years ago. And that has never really stopped being the case. And there is a
Hmm.
very like Colossians 3, your life is hidden in God with Christ, but at the same time, there's something about being in a place where there's no supports for it and people still believing is, St. Paul would tell us that is the power of God at work right there. He goes to
Hmm.
Gentiles who have no reason to expect the promises given to Israel, and yet they believe. And something very similar happening here. So, and an ascended Lord who is nevertheless present anywhere is really helpful when you have people you love all over the large spherical planet Earth, and you cannot be in the body with them at all times. Think how often Paul says,
Hmm.
I wish to be with you in the body, but I cannot be. So I'm sending this letter, or I'm sending Timothy in my place.
Hmm.
Again, the sense that presence, of course, we are, again, we're always here in this body, and yet this opens up possibilities for meaningful presence and connection, but also a promise that all of the bodily presence we long for is part of what is promised to us in the end. So that's what
Hmm.
it's meant to me as a missionary. If I may say a word about the book itself, yes, I'm
Yeah.
almost done writing it, and just final organizational bits at the last bits. But yes, I'm having a Kickstarter that starts on March 18th and runs through April 1st. So I would love it if any of your listeners would become a backer. I'll give you a link to put in the show notes, but I'm sure just type Kickstarter Sarah
Yeah.
Hinlicky Wilson Ascension, you'll find it, no problem.
I'll link
And
it for sure.
the book is called 40 Facets of the Ascension. My Transfiguration book was only 7 ways. 40 obviously
Is
comes
it going to
from
be 40 chapters?
40
That's
short
my
chapters.
my big
Yes.
question. 40 short chapters. Okay.
Yeah, not long chapters, though it is longer than the there's a lot more about the Ascension than the Transfiguration. Transfiguration is very focused and only has the 3 synoptics, 2 Peter, some allusions, whereas Ascension is like everywhere. So looking at it bit by bit turned out to be the better strategy. But I also thought the idea was that you could read it as a devotional from Easter to Ascension over the 40 days. You could read 1 facet per day. So anyone who backs me on Kickstarter, you will have the ebook before Easter Sunday. So you'll be able to read it over the 40 days leading up to Ascension. So I hope that offers a little
amazing
incentive. And eventually later this year, I will just publish it in the normal way for anyone who wants to get it then. But lots of fun bonus stuff if you back me on Kickstarter. So I hope listeners will consider that.
Yeah. Well, I also think that that's such a great way to publish. I don't know obviously you've done it before and it seems like you've had success with it, but I think it's a great way to get people involved and kind of like hear about the book from the beginning. I don't know. I feel like do you get feedback kind of early on, or how does that change the publishing process?
So Transfiguration was the first time I tried it by Kickstarter, and I loved it. It was so much more fun. You have a much more direct connection to your readers. I think readers like being connected to authors and being part of bringing something into the world. It gives me an opportunity to offer, different levels of things, whether you just want the ebook or the audiobook or a special edition hardcover, and I have other books that you can add on and stuff like that. But it just kind of gives you a sense of like actually being part of a whole creative process. I mean, I've published books in the traditional way and through my own press as well, but you can just kind of like click publish and then, whereas Kickstarter, it's really great. I mean, I can see why it's become so popular. It's a really great way of bringing more people into creative production in a way that just wasn't possible before. So yeah, I think it's tons of fun. As soon as I finished the first one, I was like, I'm definitely doing this again.
That's awesome. Well, I'm definitely going to back it because my mind has been blown and I need to read more and have it be blown again for like 40 times for sure.
Exactly.
So Sarah, thank you so much. Thank you so much for your time tonight. It was so good to see you again and to learn from you. And yeah, I just appreciate you sharing all of your knowledge with us. This is a fascinating and really, I mean, everything that you said, you have such a way of bringing it back to Christ crucified and what that means for us here and now. So I appreciate that.
Well, it's been a joy. Thank you for letting me share. You can tell I'm a preacher and I will preach at anyone who will listen. So thank you for letting me preach the joy and glory of the Ascension to you for an hour.
Anytime. Thanks. Outside Ourselves is a 1517 podcast and show. To learn more about all of our podcasts and all of our shows, please go to 1517.org/podcast. If you like today's episode, I would love if you could give the show a 5-star review wherever you are listening. If you haven't done so already, I know there are some of you out there who haven't done that, so I would really appreciate it. And if you're listening but not watching, I want to recommend that you subscribe to the Kelsey Climbera YouTube channel, which is, of course, where you can not only listen, but also watch all of the Outside Ourselves interview. Thanks so much for listening. I'll be back here in a couple weeks with our next guest.